Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tim Kahn, head of Dimensional Fund Advisors Retirement Distribution Team, and I'm pleased to bring you session number 5 in a very special 5-part series we're calling The Economics Approach to Financial Planning. For those just joining us today, let's start off with some housekeeping. First, each session is scheduled for 1.5 hours. We aim to complete our comments at the 1-hour mark and provide you 30 minutes for a robust and optional question and answer session. I'll be monitoring those questions, so please feel free to submit them as they arise or during our final 30 minutes. If you're joining us today as a financial professional and would like to receive continuing education for today's session, you only need to stay with us for 1 hour and respond to each of the CE prompts. Today's slides are available for download on the Event Resources tab. In our closing email to you today, we will provide you with a brief survey. Please give us your candid thoughts and comments to inform future events or publications on this topic. Now, a brief overview of today's topic. Today we'll be addressing Finding Alpha, Raising a Household's Living Standard at No Risk. Our presenters today are Larry Kotlikoff, Professor of Economics at Boston University and President of Economic Security Planning Incorporated, and Rick Miller, Founder and CEO of Financial Planning, which delivers economics-based financial advice to hundreds of clients using Larry's Maxify planning software as a central focus. With that, a big thank you all for joining us today, and let's kick it off. I do have some questions from the audience, some goals for today. So Rick and Larry, here's some of our marching orders. They would like to understand how to safely raise their lifetime discretionary spending through optimizing retirement, making smarter housing decisions, location decisions, and career decisions. Also making decisions that increase lifetime welfare, which I translate to more happiness for the same amount of money. So before we head it over to you, let's go over an outline of the talks. You can see we've covered a lot. We've covered consumption smoothing in our first talk. We've covered the Maxify Planner, using it to illustrate the economics approach to financial planning. Unfortunately, for those who were with us, we had an ice storm here and had to postpone when I can retire, so we're all going to keep on working for a little bit longer. Yesterday, we focused on maximizing Social Security benefits, went through 12 really interesting examples to highlight some of the 2,700 rules that govern Social Security. Today, we're going to tackle Finding Alpha, Raising a Household Living Standards at No Risk. So over to you, Rick. The challenge is to raise household standards with no risk. So can you please help us with that?
Sure can. Tim, let's see here, the slide on Finding Alpha, it would be good. That's slide 3, which I'll speak to. And financial professionals are often or in constant search for opportunities to find alpha. And it's no wonder that they're constantly looking, because it's very difficult to find. Markets are excellent information processors, and they leave little opportunity for alpha. On the other hand, in one's personal life, alpha may be just lying around, and economics-based planning can help find discretionary living standard improvements. Let's look at some examples. Okay, so on this page, we have 8 examples, and we'll have some on the following page as well. And I want to distinguish 2 categories here. Some of these are truly pure alpha, and those are changes that improve your financial situation without any kind of collateral implication. And then there are others that have personal trade-offs. And economics-based planning can illuminate the financial side of those. So the ones on this page that are pure alpha are things like optimizing retirement account contributions, because there you're optimizing the time in which you pay tax, but you have to pay the tax. Collecting the 401k match, maximizing earned income based on your employer's offer to pay you or to match your 401k contributions, and investing in paying off high interest debt. Others on this page have personal trade-offs. So, for example, taking a higher paying career or job, that generates more income, but there may be some stress associated with that, or more hours worked and less time for personal time. Marrying and sharing housing, there are clearly personal aspects to that, as well as divorce strategy. And even not borrowing for college and owning versus renting have some personal component to them. Owning versus renting, if you're, for example, not necessarily committed to a location, it may be possible in some sense to improve your living standard by purchasing, but the timing may not be right. Okay, and on the next page, there are a few more. And again, some of them are pure alpha and others have personal trade-offs. So optimizing account withdrawals, retirement account withdrawals. Again, we're working on optimizing the time at which we pay tax and paying tax at a time when when you're in a low bracket. Maximizing your lifetime Social Security benefits, which we talked about yesterday, and annuitizing some assets. Others on this page, again, have personal trade-offs. So delaying retirement, you may improve or increase your financial assets by doing that, but again, there's a time commitment involved, less leisure time. Moving, downsizing your home, and freeing trapped home equity. All of these have I wouldn't call them collateral issues, but they have personal trade-offs. Okay, so now we're going to look at some examples in detail, and there are two that we'll focus on. The first is a retirement makeover, where we're going to work with an early retiree who wonders if he can improve things financially for himself. And later, we'll look at the situation of a young woman who's trying to decide about whether to go to college and medical school. So, Larry, let's start with our retiree.
Okay, let's go to the next slide here. We're going to do a retirement makeover for John Adams. He's a hypothetical 62-year-old. He's retired, he's single, he lives in North Carolina, and he has kind of screwed up his retirement to a large extent. He's got $200,000 in his checking account. That may seem like a lot of money, but not really. $500,000 in traditional IRA assets. He's going to tap those at 72. That's his plan. That's when the minimum distribution requirements come in, required minimum distributions. He's going to get $2,500. His early reduced Social Security retirement benefit is $2,500 a month, and he's just started taking that. And he's got a $700,000 house with a $200,000 mortgage and about $15K in annual expenses for property taxes and homeowners insurance and maintenance. So let's see what else we can do for John here to try and raise his living standard. If we can go to the next slide. So this is running John's current plan. We see the lifetime balance sheet that he has. He's able to spend $661,875 on a discretionary basis over the rest of his life. That's the present value of his lifetime discretionary spending. And you can see that the housing expenses, we're looking at the right-hand side of the balance sheet here, loom pretty high. He's actually spending more on housing than he is on discretionary spending. So John's house poor. And then there's also taxes, which are not huge, $55K. The Medicare Part B premiums are actually a bigger deal for him. That's because they've been rising quite rapidly in the past and are projected to rise in the future. On the left-hand side, you see the Social Security benefits are the major source of his resources, and he's got retirement account withdrawals and also regular assets. And all these numbers are denominated in end of the year dollars. So we're assuming some inflation over the course of the year. That's why it's not exactly $200,000, but let's go to the next slide that he has in regular assets. Okay, here you see John's predicament. He's cash constrained under this plan of waiting till 72 to take his retirement money because Social Security just doesn't provide him that much. And given all the other expenses he has, the mortgage and the other housing expenses and the taxes, he's constrained so that he only gets to spend around $5,000 a year for many years until he hits 72, basically the next 10 years, and then he's able to spend at a higher level. And you see that his income is, the green is the income line, which reflects it's modest for a while, and then it jumps up when he starts taking his retirement account money. And then the fixed spending is the blue line, which involves taxes and Medicare Part B premiums and mortgage payments. And you can see a big drop when the mortgage payment ends, and that ends pretty much at the same time, ends at the same time that his retirement account money starts being withdrawn. So there's two reasons he's cash constrained. One is he's got this mortgage to pay off. The other is that he's not going to be able to get at his retirement account money till 72. So now let's move to the next slide.
Oh, Larry, just one thing. So the constraint here, as I understand it, is that he's basically limited to paying or to spending, or his income is limited to his Social Security income, and then he can spend the contents of his after-tax savings, but he's limited to those until he starts drawing from his IRA. Basically, that's why the spend is so low.
Well, also that he has the mortgage payment.
And the mortgage payment is large.
The mortgage payment is large during this period. So, okay, so he's got some issues here. He's basically kind of starving early on, and his basic level of living standard, even after he gets out from under, is not super high. It's less than $20,000 a year, even after age 72. This is all in today's dollars. So not the greatest situation. So let's see if we can do a retirement makeover. Obviously, we could John could try and get another job and go back to work. And that might be the best thing for him to do, but maybe he can't work for some reason, physical or otherwise. So, so that's, this is just repeating his predicament. This is just saying he's broke. He's only getting to spend $5,091. Then he gets to spend $18,679 after 72. So let's go to the next slide and think about how we can try and help John out here. And what I'm going to do here really represents a form of money magic. One of the things that one of the co-CEOs, Dave Butler of DFA, is quoted as saying is control what you can control. And the whole point of this talk is the fact that there's lots of things you can control when it comes to safely raising your living standard, whereas you can't necessarily control how the market's going to do. You can clearly try and reduce your risk by diversifying your portfolio. You can try and get higher returns by investing in better run, better managed assets. But in this area, there's lots of things to control, as we'll see that John has control over. So one thing he can do is he can start taking his IRA money immediately. Now, I'm assuming in the calculations that we ran in Maxify for this case that John's getting a zero real return, because that's essentially what the market is saying you can get in the stock market on a risk-adjusted basis. So yes, the stock market has a return that on average has been about 6.5% real since 1950, maybe a little bit higher. But when you risk adjust the stock market today, that brings you to the inflation indexed bond market. That's the TIPS market, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. And the return on 30-year TIPS right now is about zero as of the last couple of days. So on a risk-adjusted basis, John's really earning nothing by investing in stock. In other words, the risk that he's incurring is very expensive. And at the margin, the market is saying that he and others are indifferent between investing in this risky thing versus earning nothing for sure in this inflation index bond market. But let's have him take his IRA and treat it as if it's invested in tips, because he should be indifferent, because that's what the market, pricing says you're if you're buying apples and oranges and the apple costs $2 and the orange is $1, then you're indifferent between one apple and two oranges at the margin. That's what market prices are telling us. And that holds in finance as well as in apples and orange markets. So,
Hey, Larry,
what we've done here,
Larry, this is Tim here. Just a couple of questions from our audience while we're on the topic. About 3 of them wanting to know if there's any difference if that was a Roth or a traditional or a rollover IRA. Kind of all 3 asking kind of the similar question. Does your analysis change whether it's traditional, Roth, or a contributory, which is traditional? So any difference in analysis, whether it's based on the tax advantage of this IRA?
Well, yeah, that would bring us into if it were Roth money that he would have, then he could take it early without having any tax liabilities.
Right.
So his fixed spending wouldn't be impacted.
Gotcha.
If it was, a non-tax deductible IRA, some fraction of the money that he withdrew early on would be taxable. The principal would not of the withdrawals. So that would certainly change him. He'd be in a better position if all the IRA was in Roth money. Obviously, there wouldn't be any tax obligation. So this brings us to the whole issue of Roth conversions. When is it a good idea?
Just one moment before we do that, because I do want to get to the Roth conversions. But on this slide, you see that the discretionary spending rises, and my suspicion, because he's starting the IRA early or earlier, and my suspicion is that part of the gain here in discretionary spending is due to the fact that he's able to draw some of this IRA when he's in a really low tax bracket. And so he's getting tax savings by accelerating the start of the IRA draw. And that gives him the increase in discretionary spending. The second benefit, though, the elimination of the cash constraint, that doesn't depend on whether it's a Roth or a traditional.
Yeah, let me say it's a little more complicated. I didn't actually, I should have looked a little bit more closely at the results here for John, but he's taking his Social Security early still in this analysis. So by taking his IRA money early, he may be kicking up the taxation of his Social Security benefit. So his taxes could actually rise because of that, both federal and state. Some of the states tax their Social Security benefits just like the feds do. And in addition, he's taking his Medicare starting at 65. And, the Medicare Part B premium, as you well know, Rick, is a function of your modified adjusted gross income 2 years before you start collecting that Medicare benefit. So if you're starting at 65, which is the earliest age you can start collecting Medicare, and he has no other health coverage, so he's going to be collecting Medicare, that's what we've assumed. Well, the premium he's going to face at 65 will depend on his modified adjusted gross income, his MAGI at age 63. The MAGI at age 64 is going to impact his premium, the Part B premium at 66, and so forth. So we might have got him into a lower tax bracket through this, but we may also have raised his taxes through producing higher Social Security benefit taxation, and we may also have raised his IRMA.
It's possible. It's possible, but the increase in spending has to come from somewhere. He's got to have higher net resources. So, and if it, well, the only way really to see is, and we don't have it with us. The only way really to see is to look at the lifetime balance sheet and see where the changes occur.
The program says exactly what's going on. I just didn't. I should have looked at it closely, but it could be that his lifetime spending actually goes down, but it's smoother. His living standard is smoother. So there's no, the main thing that this move did was to smooth his living standard, to get him out from under the cash constraint. But it's possible that the taxes actually went up, and that the Medicare premium, certainly they went up, or potentially went up, but actually they might have gone down, because if you think about it, Rick, he's got less income in the years after age 72. So his MAGI, his modified adjusted gross income after 72 will be lower, and therefore his Medicare Part B premiums will be lower. They'll be higher earlier, lower later. So this is pretty complicated stuff. It's not, and the answer is not going to be the same thing for any two households. That's why it's very important to have software that can take into account all the peculiarities of a given household. But this is just showing you the potentiality of finding alpha for an arbitrarily chosen household. But okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now let's have John move to Texas. So he's was in North Carolina. There were some state income taxes. Moving to Texas, but maintaining the same housing. He buys a house in Texas. I'm assuming there's no transactions costs. He maintains the same mortgage. He has the same annual housing cost, $15,000. Well, this raises his lifetime discretionary spending by about $3,000. It's not huge, it's something. So the state tax differences are not major because John's relatively poor. If John were a rich person, and especially if he were still working and earning a fair amount of money, moving to Texas might make a huge difference to his lifetime discretionary spending. What about the next one, Tim? Well, okay, so now let's have John do something with his house, namely downsize it. So he buys a house in Texas where things are, housing is cheaper, I'm assuming, than in North Carolina. So it's possible that buying a house that's half as expensive could actually entail the same amount of space. It could even be a larger square foot house that he buys. In this particular calculation, we're going to keep his mortgage at $200,000 and the same interest rate, so the same mortgage payments. So now we've raised his discretionary spending by almost $600,000, and that's a huge increase in his annual spending, from $16,000 a year to over $30,000. So a huge increase.
And I suspect that there are two sources of this big benefit. One of them is that he's got reduced annual housing expenses, so his insurance is lower, and his real estate taxes are lower, and the costs of maintenance are lower, and so forth. And the second is that he's pulled some of his home equity out, right? And that's now available to spend. So if he had children, that would be maybe a concern to his children. But since in this example he doesn't, it's all to the good for John.
Absolutely, yeah. With kids, it would be reducing the equity bequest, home equity bequest. But you got exactly right. He saves $7,500 a year on these housing expenses, and then he's pulling out in trapped equity. Well, I think he had $550,000, so he's like $225,000. He's freeing up to spend on his discretionary spending over the rest of his life through this method. Okay, so the next slide, let's see if we can do some more money magic for John. You started to see where the title of my book, Money Magic, that I just was just released in January, came from. Let's have him pay off his mortgage. So why is that a good move? Well, we're assuming that he's investing on in a safe manner, and the nominal interest rate that's associated with the TIPS return of 0 is about 2%, but his mortgage is at 4%. So there's a differential there. And if he pays off that 30-year mortgage, even though it's been reduced, it's still $200,000, paying that off at immediately is in effect making 2% arbitrage on this move. He's basically earning 2% on $400,000, roughly speaking, year in and year out for a while. It's not exactly that calculation, but it turns out it's a decent sized number, $27,272. So now we've got his discretionary spending going up to $30,719. Remember, when we first started him out, he was spending around $5,000 the first 10 years of his life. Now we've got him spending 6 times more in the first 10 years of his life. He's ecstatic. I mean, this is like going from a world of starvation to a world of ecstasy. Well, maybe that's not the right term here to use, but anyway, happiness. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a big one. Let's have John start his Social Security at 70. So we've done some things to rearrange his retirement so that he's tried to reduce his cash constraints. We got rid of his mortgage. We reduced his housing costs, and this is increasing his discretionary spending by $425,000. That's a huge amount of money for John, and his annual discretionary spending is going up till age 70. It's rising from $30,719 up to $39,000, going up by about $1,400 a year. But then after age 70, it's about $10,000 higher from age 70 till the end of his days. So that's a big impact. Let's go to the next slide.
Before we go. So this is pure alpha, but many people in doing this might find this a bit distressing, because they will see, before Social Security benefits start at 70, they will see their financial assets coming down more rapidly than they would have otherwise. So, and that's something that can be difficult. People have saved their whole lives. John has accumulated savings after tax and also in his IRA. And now we're saying you should spend it faster, right? And wait until 70 to take your Social Security. That's benefits. That is difficult for many people to sort of to make the link, if you will.
Great points, both Rick and Larry. The questions are coming in on that. Specifically, are there any tricks or are there ways to describe that hesitation to tap in to an IRA early? So any thoughts? Maybe the discretionary spending increase, software, counsel by an advisor. Have you any tricks of the trade that can help our folks out?
Well, I think...
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I think the psychological thing is that people probably have their IRA in the market, and everybody's sure they're going to make a killing in the market, and they don't take into account the risk. But if the market were safe, Wall Street is telling us that markets, if you hold stocks for any 30-year holding period, you're going to come out ahead. Well, we don't have data on independent 30-year holding periods. We basically have 3 data points, because if we look at 30-year holding periods, from every year forward for 30 years, we're using the same data over and over again. So there's no statistical real power in that kind of statement. We know that there are stock markets like the Japanese market, the German stock market, that over 30-year periods have done poorly, really badly. So the stock market's really risky. If it weren't, you wouldn't be seeing tips yielding 0 right now. Last week, they were yielding a negative return, 30-year tips. Nobody, if they're perfectly safe, everybody should dump their bonds and their tip, whether nominal bonds or tips, and just buy stocks. Why would anybody be holding anything but stocks if they were perfectly safe? So they're not safe, and nobody should think that. So the first psychological hurdle is to understand that the stocks are not yielding anything real after risk. They're yielding nothing. That it's a bad investment. It's a kind of it's not necessarily a bad investment in the sense of diversify. You want to be diversified, but it's not a high yielding for sure thing. Okay, unless you have, unless you've got better than average investment advice, which you may get from the DFA, and they're certainly in the business of trying to help you in that sphere. But in general, the stock market is not safe, and so we don't want to be giving up a move in Social Security, which has a guaranteed extremely high real return. We talked about this last time, for something that has a guaranteed risk-adjusted zero return. So Rick, maybe you have some more comments.
There is a second aspect to this, Tim, which is there's a psychological change that occurs when people retire. They go from earning and accumulating to not earning and decumulating. And they've spent, in this case, John has spent probably 35 or 40 years accumulating this IRA and his after-tax savings. And now we're saying, wait until 70 to draw your Social Security benefits, your retirement benefits, and just, you have the money that you've saved it to retire on, go ahead, spend it. But if he's funding his full spending amount, he's going to see those savings decline pretty rapidly. If he's funding 40 or 30,000 or 39,000 discretionary, and another I don't know what the number is, but another $10,000 or $15,000 a year in non-discretionary spending, that's going to drop his savings pretty rapidly, and that can be scary.
Yeah.
And you can say, and we do say, well, John, but when you get to be 70, the rate at which you're going to be drawing from your assets is going to be much lower, and you're going to have that a much higher floor of income to rely on if you do it that way. But it is psychologically difficult, and it takes, I think, a lot of discussion, and we're not always successful.
But let me be clear, though. We're not saying that people have to take this extra spending power and spend it. If they want to put it aside for reserve fund, for a home, for entrance into a nicer Medicaid facility if they need one, or a home assisted living facility, or give it to their, if John wants to give it to his nephew, leave aside, he could save up this money. The point is that he's got extra lifetime spending power for free with no risk whatsoever. And right. I think the other thing to say to him, so we're not saying, hey, you have to just save, you have to eat up your assets. If you want to continue to spend up for the next 10 years at $5,000 a year and take those IRA withdrawals early, you could even leave them in the market. You could choose not to, but then it becomes a question of how you're going to, the lifetime spending is going up in each of these steps.
Right.
So the resources that can be accumulated and not spent are there. This is free money. What you do with it is not something ridiculous.
So Larry, before we move on from Social Security, and we did talk about this in yesterday's session, there are some questions around the solvency of Social Security and planning around that. So before we move from this slide, what is your counsel around the concerns that quote-unquote Gen Xers have, being told that Social Security will disappear, and using Social Security to plan for?
Well, I would say for Gen Xers, I think for older people, the chances of major benefit cuts, people that are already collecting or close to collecting, especially if they're middle upper income class, if they're super rich, maybe a different story. those benefits might be cut significantly. But for this other group, I don't think we're going to see much in the way of benefit cuts, if any. We might see higher taxation. But for Gen Xers and Gen Zers, millennials, we got a system that's 59 trillion in the red. That's the official debt in the hands of the public that hasn't been bought back, the debt that the Treasury has issued and that the Fed has not printed money up to buy that paper back, is about the size of the GDP, which is about $23 trillion. You'll hear a number 30 trillion, but that's the gross debt. If you net out how much the Fed has got in its hands, the debt in the hands of the public is about 23 trillion. So the Social Security debt is about 2.5 times larger. So the system's in terrible shape. We need to get serious. I think the boomers are the last generation that are going to get by with the system the way it is. The younger people can't count on the government. They can't count on their employers. They have to save at a much higher rate. They have to think about retiring much later. They have to be, trying every trick they can to raise their lifetime earnings. Think about their career choice. And we have an example coming up in a second about career choice.
Okay.
So anyway, maybe that's a good enough answer.
It's sobering, but let's hope that's not true. But what folks do have is their IRA. So maybe we can go to that example and we can talk about what a person has done, John, in his IRA and what he can do there.
Okay, so one option that John would have would be, a further option would be to take his IRA and annuitize it, which is, take his money and buy a stream of payments that continue until he dies. And since he's single, and by assumption not worried about not leaving money to his kids or spouse, he'll be able to get a higher rate of return, because if he does die, the money will go to the insurance company rather than back to him. So the insurance company is willing to pay a higher return. And this can raise his discretionary spending even further. As we can see, he's up to 39,000 before age 70 and 42,000 after age 70. So let's go next.
I wonder if you'd like to say anything about annuities and inflation and whether there's any concern about that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was about to say that. Inflation this last month is running at 7.5%. That was today's news. And I don't personally expect it to come down. The markets seem to think it's going to come down very quickly, but I don't see that happening. So if you buy an annuity, and you can only buy inflation nominal annuities, annuities that pay off in dollars, you can arrange your annuity payment to be graded so that it starts lower and rises through time at some fixed rate. But that doesn't protect you against inflation, because the grading, the rate at which it rises, is fixed ahead of time, independent of what the inflation rate is. So there's no real inflation protection, although some of the insurance companies who are selling these graded annuities will claim this is protecting you against inflation. Don't believe it. The story with inflation is that because of inflation, annuities are quite risky. We just lost, people with an annuity, nominal annuity, lost 7% over the last year. The real value of that benefit, not just in 1 year, but the rest of time. It's always going to be worth 7% less in real terms forever. So if you're going to buy an annuity these days, what I would do is try and get some kind of an inflation hedge. So I'll give you an example of somebody I just spoke with this morning on the telephone. One of the clients using Maxify, he's got 5 different annuities. He's a doctor who retired, lives in Florida, has 5 annuities. He wanted just to have his entire retirement locked down, no mortgages, and thought he's set for life. And so we had a discussion about how to enter the annuities in the program, but then I talked about the inflation risk. And he said that his plan for dealing with inflation, if it continues, was to drop his country club memberships. That was his plan. I said, maybe there's a different way we can hedge your risk that doesn't involve you're lowering your living standard. And what I suggested was that he think about taking out mortgages on his two properties. He can borrow a fair amount on his two homes that he has paid off, and then he could use that money and buy inflation index bonds. So if he does this, if inflation takes off, he gets a gain because the mortgage repayment in real terms goes down. He wins on the mortgage. The inflation index bond is protected because it's inflation adjusted. So there's a net gain there. So that's a natural hedge. Now there's a couple issues here. One is that he'd have to borrow at a mortgage rate which is above the lending rate, and is probably 4% today. It's going up. And the other thing is that inflation index bonds, the nominal component of the return on those bonds is subject to taxation. So it's not an open and shut insurance gimmick or arrangement or solution, but on balance, I think it would protect somebody who is buying an annuity. You could just borrow, if you didn't already have an annuity, you could just borrow in your house and buy an annuity. So now inflation takes off, the annuity declines in real value, the mortgage declines in real value, it's kind of a wash. And I've run cases with clients where you can pretty well roll your own inflation indexed annuity in this manner. But maybe, Rick, you have some comments?
I have one more, which is that Social Security is the best inflation indexed annuity going, and it's cheap. I mean, that in the sense that, as we talked about just a couple of slides ago, deferring from 62 to 70 allows you to, in effect, buy a lot more of it, and the rate is better than competitive.
Yeah, giving up benefits for 8 years, you can get a 76% higher retirement benefit if you wait from 62 to 70 to start your retirement benefit. But Tim, let's go on to the next slide. And this is just summarizing the retirement remake we did for makeover we did for John. The first move was he takes his IRAs at 62, starts withdrawing at that age, moves to Texas, downsizes his home in half, pays off his mortgage. He starts Social Security at 70 rather than 62, and then he annuitizes. And again, this is not taking into account the risk of inflation. So this last bit about annuitizing, I wouldn't do in today's environment unless I had some kind of inflation hedge. I think it's just way too risky to be buying a nominal security. That's my, suggestion or view. It's not. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not giving financial advice here or in any of the talks we've given. I'm not registered or qualified to do that. I'm just an economist. We don't know that much, right? Right, Rick?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
You're an economist. You have a PhD in economics.
All right.
So I can't even make a joke with you on this one. Okay, but the gains are really substantial of doing everything we've done here for John. His lifetime discretionary spending goes up by basically a factor of almost 2.76 increase in lifetime present value of discretionary spending. His annual spending before 70 goes from $5,000 to $39,000 a year for the first 10 years, and then it's from about $19,000 to $39,000 from 70 all the way to 100 if he makes it that long, all in today's dollars. So this is an enormous change in his retirement with no real risk apart from the issue of inflation that we just talked about. Let's go to the next slide because we need to quickly get to the other case that we're going to talk about. So what else can John do for to safely raise his living standard? Well, he could get married or find a partner, and there's fantastic economies of shared living. You know, the house is basically two can live as cheaply as one in one house, you know, if you think about it. But if you're married, you need just one heating, you need one stove, one heating system. It's not just the physical structure, but there's all the appliances, the utilities, you're all sharing those. And then you're also sharing the leftovers, and you're sharing the car, and a whole bunch of other things that my wife and I share her guitar, for example. We had two guitars. I gave one of mine to one of my sons because we didn't need to have two guitars. So it's an example. Anyway, so this could raise John's living standard by 40% just by getting married or partnering or just having a roommate where they live together, a good buddy. Doesn't have to be, you know, anything romantic. It could just be two 2-year-olds decide to live together and raise their living standard, and by 40% is my estimate. And this would be apart from the housing. So the next slide. So now let's talk about a different type of money magic, which is career choice. What about becoming, and by the way, in this talk today, there's a whole lot of things that we're not going to be able to cover, like Roth conversions, when you start your withdrawals of your retirement accounts, contributing to retirement accounts so that you can get your employer match, whether or not you should borrow for college. If you do borrow for college, how you should repay, what method of repayment that you have available to you should you use. I cover these things in the book. Some of them you can, most of them, all of them you can model in the software. But here we got the choice of career: doctor, plumber. The first chapter of my book is called My Daughter the Plumber. And let's go to the next slide. California Jane's a young gal, lives in California. If she becomes a doctor, she's 18. She's thinking about 4 years of going to college for $50K in tuition per year. That's not the room and board, that's just the tuition. She's got 4 years of medical school that she's thinking about if she does college. That'd be about $70,000 according to current rates. As an intern, she'd earn about $62,000 for 3 years, intern and being resident. And then she'd finally get to work as a PCP and earn about $195,000 between 29 and 62. But she'd also have to borrow money to pay for all these expenses for school, but also to feed herself and house herself. So I did the calculation. It looked like she'd have to borrow $64,000. She'd have to repay $64,000 per year in nominal dollars for 25 years, starting at 26. Now that may sound like, here she's going to be 51 until she's still paying off her student loans. There's tons of people out there that are paying off their student loans even in their 60s. So this is not unusual. This is not at all unrealistic, I don't think, for this decision. Let's go to the next slide. So what about if Jane becomes a plumber? Well, her starting salary would be about $50,000, and then she'll probably end up with about $100,000 at 28. If she becomes by 29 a master plumber, be about 150,000. If she lives in Beverly Hills and is a great plumber, recommended by the one star to the next, she'd probably make twice this amount. But these are just kind of averages for California that I found online. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is, everything else equal, which career path is going to produce higher lifetime discretionary spending? And I don't know ahead of time before I run these things what is the answer. I said, let me just go by the numbers that I can find for what it costs to go to college, and I know something about that and what medical school costs, and I look that up on the web and think about how much you need to borrow to feed herself and so forth. And these are all quite reasonable numbers I put into the program. She ends up doing better as a plumber, $105,000 better. Her Social Security decisions are the same. Everything else is being held constant. It's just career lifetime earnings that are different here. So let me pause and see if, Rick, you have any comments you'd like to make?
I think perhaps, Larry, we could go to the next slide and then I have comments.
Okay, so this is giving a little bit of a picture of what's going on between the two cases. So because she becomes a plumber, she does become a plumber, she ends up paying tuition loan repayments are $1.5 million less. Her taxes, lifetime taxes, are lower. All her earnings are not clumped into a smaller number of years where she's going to be facing higher marginal taxes. The tax system treats her as if she's lifetime rich, whereas a good part of her, the first 11 years of her life, she's poor. She's earning nothing, but she's not getting any credit when it comes to paying taxes. As soon as she becomes a doctor and starts earning a good salary, she's treated as if she's among the rich, and she's taxed at a high marginal rate, federal and state. Especially in California, the top rate is 13%. I'm not sure, I don't think she's at that rate, but she's at a high rate. And then we've got her Medicare premiums are lower by her lifetime payments. So it's a small difference, $1,000 or so. Now on the left-hand side, we see that her lifetime earnings decreased by $926,000. So she makes less money. And her Social Security benefits are lower too because she makes less money. And her special receipts, the inflow of loans are smaller. She's not borrowing this money. But on balance, she's actually better off because the costs, the savings on the tuition and loan repayments and the taxes beat the reduction in labor earnings and the loss of reduction in Social Security benefits. And she ends up about $100,000 better off. And maybe there's less stress being a plumber because you don't have to worry about making the wrong decision for your patients. You don't have to have the stress if they're not doing well, become friends with them and suffer with them when they're going through major illnesses. Maybe life as a plumber, even if you have to be called, occasionally in the middle of the night to stop a leak, is much better than being called in the middle of the night to deal with somebody's, throwing out their back. I don't know. But anyway, let's go to the next slide.
Well, now I have my comments. So okay. A couple of things here. First of all, there are many different kinds of physicians, and Jane chose for this example to be a primary care physician, which is at the lower end in terms of compensation. So there are other specialties that pay more that might turn the analysis in the other direction.
Right.
Jane, it's also true that physicians tend to work longer than plumbers do. So there is it's quite likely, I shouldn't say quite likely, it's quite possible that Jane would work longer. And again, that might flip the numbers of the analysis. For me, the moral of this story is that, first of all, if you're going to borrow a lot of money for college or for education, it's very important to think it through from a financial perspective and to look at how much it's going to cost and what the return might be. And we've heard, all of us, I'm sure, have heard of stories of people who borrowed a lot of money to become, let's say, an art historian. And it's basically hopeless, right? That they borrowed an enormous amount of money. Art historians don't make that much money. They're going to be in debt basically for the rest of their lives. And that's a very unfortunate and serious financial error. We could call it kind of negative alpha almost.
Yeah, I think you're kind of thinking about the example in my chapter in my book called Don't Borrow for College. 40% of the kids who start college never finish. So a lot of these kids are borrowing for the privilege of dropping out of college. And I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter about a student in my undergraduate class. I made the mistake of asking the kids how much they borrowed, and this student ended up in tears as a result of my questioning, because she had borrowed, I don't know, over $100,000, and she was an art history, and she was a senior art history major, and she was trying to get a job, just even an internship, an unpaid internship for the summer after senior year, and nobody was responding. And this was before COVID. And it was clear that she had borrowed so much money that she was not going to be in a position to be able to pursue her career in art history. She had, made that impossible. So you could certainly borrow to do X and borrow so much that X is impossible. And what we really should be thinking about, especially for the advisors who are on this Zoom, that advisors have a role to play in talking to 18-year-olds. They should go out of their way to try and sign up 18-year-olds as their clients and say, before you go to college, before you choose college, come sit down with me and maybe do it for half price or no price, just as a public service. And let's just talk about what this is going to, whether this will pay off for you and what you're getting into. You've got these 5 different schools, they're offering you different amounts, and they're providing loans, awards, and they're describing loans as part of the award. If I tell you, Rick, that I'm making an award to you that involves your borrowing money from me, would you call that an award? Have you been awarded anything? This is what they do.
I would say that the various different elements of the package have very different financial implications, and
Yeah.
grants and loans have very different financial implications. I'm mindful of our time here, Larry. We have just a minute, and we have 2 slides. So
Okay, let's go to those 2 slides.
Okay, so there we go.
Yeah, the other thing is that Jane would be severely constrained prior to becoming a PCP, and this is also very important, versus if she becomes a plumber, she's still cash constrained, but her living standard starts out much higher, so the constraint is much less severe. So that's another thing that we need to think about. And by the way, what's going on for kids like Jane is that they can't borrow that much for college. There's a limit about $31,000, $32,000, but their parents can borrow as much as they want on the kid's behalf. But the interest rate that the parents can borrow on a parental loan from the federal government, because almost all these loans are federal government loans, is much higher than the interest rate that Uncle Sam lends to students, to undergrads. So we don't know whether Jane here is she might be borrowing additional money. She's already borrowing a whole lot of money in my example, and she's still cash constrained dramatically. But if her parents borrow even more money on her behalf to help her, they might be giving her that obligation once she becomes a doctor. They might say, look, we've been saving up this loan obligation that we took out for you to get you through to medical school, to get you through to this job. And here it's yours to repay. We tried to repay a little bit of it. We just paid the interest. The principal's here. It's all yours. We did this for you. Enjoy. And or the parents might say, we'll take care of it, but we're going to leave you in effect less money as inheritance. So either way, Jane ends up paying for anything that the parents borrow, unless the parents take a cut in their own living standard. Let's go to the last slide. So, Rick, why don't you wind us up here?
Okay. So I think that the main message that we're trying to communicate here is that you can use economics-based planning to compare one career against another, one job against another, one house against another, et cetera, and clearly estimate, get a very sharp quantitative estimate of the impact of one choice versus the other. And often there are the choice that is advantaged will give you a substantially better level of discretionary spending. So these decisions all are susceptible to analysis using economics-based planning, and you get a much more confidence in your answer, and you're much more likely to get the right answer if you use that approach.
So thank you, Rick and Larry. I think we're coming up right at the top of the hour. And for those that are joining us for continuing education, if you have clicked yes, you are watching, then you are at the top of the hour and you are good for your continuing education. We're going to continue on. We've got over 500 folks, well over 300 questions, a lot that are very individualistic that we can't answer, but just a couple that came in on your last point there. I think you demonstrated it well, Rick. Some folks talking about, well, what about school and following your passion? It's not always an economic, trying to maximize your utility there. Mm-hmm. Financial planning allows you to have a better decision, right? It's not telling you necessarily which passion to follow. How would you counsel family members who have folks who want to go to college, but it might not be feasible economic, but still is still is important for them?
I would say that this approach allows you to quantify the financial impact or the likely financial impact of a decision. And then once informed by that quantitative information, people can make a better decision about how much they really want to pursue that passion. I've looked at a number of these, actually. I've looked at pursuing a career in the NBA, pursuing a career in the arts, and in both of those cases, one of the major issues is that people, especially young people who are considering the career, see how much the highest paid players or how much the highest paid actors or artists are making, and they may do their economic analysis on that basis. But if you look at the median in those particular careers, it's much less attractive, and the odds of success are very, very small. So it's wise to have a plan B. Gotcha. I guess is the way I would put it.
So for Rick and for Larry, I think some folks are just thinking about a summary. You've talked a lot about different sources of alpha. What's the biggest source of alpha? What's the biggest dial they can do? You've mentioned several here. In your opinions, what's the most important throughout one's livelihood? What dial should they be focusing on most?
Well, I would say when you're young, it's your career and then the job within your career. as you get a little bit older, you want to be careful about the housing, whether you're spending too much on housing, whether you're house poor. As you hit retirement age, the biggest thing is your Social Security decisions. They're paramount. And then, clearly, like I've been anti stocks throughout this, discussion, but there are safe ways to invest in the stock market that protect your living standard. You can basically choose not to, assuming you can spend as if your risky assets are not going to return anything. They'll be lost 100%. And then you could invest all your other assets in inflation index bonds and set a floor to your living standard. And then if the risky assets turn out to be pay off, then you can have an upside to your living standard later in life when you start converting those risky assets to safe assets. So there are ways to handle investment risk without, jeopardy to your basic living standard. And economics, teaches this as well. But again, human capital when you're young, housing, not overdoing that, making sure you save enough, making sure you have a plan from the get-go so that you're saving enough and not overspending. And then it's got to be a lifetime plan, not retiring too early, and dealing properly with Social Security. These are really the fundamentals. And then you can layer on top of that Roth conversions and things of that nature.
Right. Let's,
Tim, I agree
Rick,
with all
yeah,
of that.
please.
And
Let's,
I would add one thing, which
Yeah.
is, as Larry said, early in life, your career is, and your earning power is your biggest asset. And a couple of things that I would say. First is that people who are happy in their careers tend to be more successful. There's a virtuous circle involved in doing something that you really enjoy. And you tend to be more effective, more successful, and earn more. And secondly, you're more likely to earn longer if you enjoy what you're doing. We have lots of clients who come to us in their late 50s and say, I'm just worn out. I don't want to work anymore. And I wouldn't say they're at their peak earning power, but they're at high earning power. And they're giving up a lot of financial resources by retiring at that point. If they're doing something that they really enjoy, then they can work longer. And that adds to their financial resources. And it also reduces their risk in that there are fewer years where they're depending on their investments and depending on their savings. And they're more financially resilient. You're more financially resilient the longer you work.
Excellent. A couple other questions. Inflation is top of mind. You've mentioned that. Can you talk about tips, and were you referring to I-bonds when you mentioned inflation bonds? And that's, can you tell a little bit about I-bonds? So maybe where you buy them, the maximum limit, how they reset, if you want to just kind of go over the broad category of I-bonds, and then maybe a little bit about tips as well.
I'll tell you what I know about it. I'm not a world's expert. I think you can buy up to 10,000, you and your spouse. If you've got kids, they could buy 10,000 each year. So you could save a fair amount in I-bonds. I-bonds, I think the Treasury sets the interest rate, the nominal interest rate, exogenously, independent of market conditions. So in the past, they have provided a generous return, and they are inflation adjusted so that if inflation takes off, they'll give you the coupon plus times the inflation rate that we experience. The other thing is that you don't have to cash them out at any certain date, and the money that's accumulating inside the I-bond is not taxable until you do the cashing out. So they're kind of like a IRA from that perspective, a taxable IRA. And I think they're immune from state income taxes. I don't think that they're taxable under state income taxes, from what I understand. Rick, do you have any corrections?
Yeah, there are no corrections. I think all that's true.
Yep.
They are available at treasurydirect.gov. And I would caution that the website is a little bit clunky, but it can be navigated. Purchases cannot be withdrawn for a year, so you should be sure that you don't need the money for at least a year. And for the first 5 years, if you withdraw the funds, the last 3 months of interest is forfeited. But, but everything that Larry said was true.
Excellent. A lot of questions on annuities. So if you can go back a little bit, and we talked about annuities, and I do believe there is no commercial product that has that inflation protection. But you did mention the resets, right? A lot of them will say they have COLAs, right? A cost of living adjustment. There's also a question about GMWBs, guaranteed minimum withdrawal funds, mostly in, I believe, 401ks in my world, or guaranteed GM and GL WBs. So those two are not inflation protected. Is that true, without getting into any specifics of any organization?
That's correct. They're not inflation protected.
Right.
And these resets, this rating, the fact that your annuity might go up with time has nothing to do with the inflation rate. If it could be that you buy something that rises 3% a year, the payout, and they call this a graded inflation protected annuity. But if inflation is 20%, they're not going to increase your annuity by an extra 17 percentage points. It's just going to go up by 3%.
Right.
So you'll be wiped out. So there's no real protection coming from the insurance companies. Now, they might get back into the business of offering inflation indexed annuities, given where inflation is these days.
Okay. Couple other questions. So what is your counsel about buying tips directly versus buying them in a mutual fund? Any concern versus the mutual fund in purchasing tips or buying directly?
You can, if you buy the tips directly, we advise people to do that primarily if they are funding a spending stream that they can predict. So it's a way of immunizing yourself against inflation and against interest rate changes. If you're matching assets and liabilities, if you're matching the timing of the maturation of the bond with spending that you're planning to do. If you're not doing that, then we would recommend using funds instead, mutual funds instead, because it's not free to transact in these bonds.
Right.
And especially if you're going to be reinvesting them. So suppose you're 30 and you buy a 30-year bond, it's going to mature when you're 60 and you're still earning. You haven't retired yet, so you're going to have to buy another one. Instead of transacting like that and taking the transaction cost and paying the transaction costs, it's probably more efficient to buy a mutual fund. Gotcha.
Excellent. One of the things we didn't spend a lot of time on, and this might be a very general response, but we have someone who attended and wants your general thoughts on long-term care insurance. I've heard it's expensive to get. You pay for it for decades. What do you counsel your either your readers or your clients on long-term care insurance? And let me add one more versus self-insuring. So let's just, long-term care insurance, is it worth it? And then also, what do you think about self-insuring versus long-term care?
Long-term care is very difficult to think about and to insure against. I will say that the premiums for long-term care insurance have risen substantially over the past 5 or 10 years, and it is a much less attractive way, an efficient way of protecting yourself against that risk, that long-term care risk. If we look at who can self-insure, it tends to be people who are relatively wealthy, who have whose spending is already at the level of the cost of long-term care. And if they need long-term care, then they're not going to be spending on the other elements of their plan that they had been. So if we make it very simple, suppose that we're talking about a single person who owns their home. That person is spending discretionary spending, and that person is also paying the costs of their housing, the annual cost of their housing. If those two together add up to the cost of long-term care, and especially if we're talking about skilled nursing, then a person who needs skilled nursing is not going to be living at home. So those annual housing expenses, which are already in the plan, can be applied toward long-term care. And if their discretionary spending is high, then if they're in skilled nursing, they're not going to be spending much on discretionary spending. And if you add those two together and it covers the cost of skilled nursing, then that person can effectively afford to self-insure, just on a straight annual spending basis. Beyond that, then you get into the question of if you're going to use, let's say, home equity. Now I go back to something that Larry said about family insurance, right? You and your children are in effect insuring you against the potential risk of long-term care.
Right.
So that's my view. Larry may have.
Well, I would just add to that so in our software you can set up different profiles. So you could model self-insuring, where you have special expenses for an assumed major stay in a let's say a nursing home. Maybe it's $100,000 a year for 10 years, starting at 85, versus buying an insurance policy where you have the special expenses of paying for the premium, but then in the future, when you do need to go into this nursing home under this scenario, there would be less that you would have to pay because the insurance company would come and pay some of the insurance would pay off. Now, one of the big concerns here is, whether the insurance company is trustworthy, whether their fine print, whether they're really going to pay off, but also inflation. If medical costs and home health care, nursing home costs rise dramatically, does this policy have any inflation protection that, right. Or are you stuck with the difference? So you can see pretty quickly, kind of by running different scenarios, how much risk you might be facing if you self-insure versus get the insurance, and you can run it with different inflation scenarios. So there's nothing that says you can't run the program, once with the inflation at this level, another with the inflation maybe starting low and going up, or starting high and going down. The program has that flexibility. The other thing I wanted to say is that, ending up at the end of your days with some resources like home equity can be a good security blanket for getting into a better facility, a better Medicaid facility, or a better Medicaid. A lot of people, middle class, who need nursing home, end up on Medicaid because it's so expensive. And the way the market in these Medicaid facilities works, as I understand it, because I experienced this with two parents, is that if you have a chunk of money, maybe it's from a house that you are selling, or from assets that you've saved up. Maybe this guy, John, doesn't spend all the extra spending power that we got for him, but he accumulates it up as a reserve fund. And you can enter that in the program too. So now he reaches 85, he needs to go into a home health care facility, assisted living facility, and he goes around, shops around, and they say, he finds one he likes, it's nice. And they say, well, look, if you come and spend a couple of years as a private pay patient, we'll transition you onto Medicaid and you can stay here with us. for the rest of your days. And so that's the value of assets. There is really a market to buy into a nicer facility. And so having these assets, a lot of people are saying you want to kind of, if you're going to likely go onto Medicare or Medicaid, you want to divulge yourself of all your assets. You want to give them away or spend them down because otherwise you're going to be lost. But there is a use for them, which is to get yourself into a nicer place.
Excellent. All right, as we prepare to wrap up, a great comment from financial advisor noting on long-term care insurance that most, if not all, are for a finite amount and lack lifetime benefit policies, are very hard to find if there are any more. So great comment. Any thoughts on that, Rick, or the finite amount of that? Or
I agree.
Okay. Okay.
It used to be that you could buy coverage for a lifetime coverage, and the ideal policy would be what is sometimes called a stop loss policy or catastrophic policy, where the person who's buying the insurance would in effect have a deductible of a year or two of costs, but then the insurance carrier would cover from that point on, no matter how long the stay was. But those policies are no longer available.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah. The other thing to say is that if you do have kids, they may be your best insurance. If you don't need skilled nursing, but you need assistance, moving in with your kids, having them move in with you, doing a deal whereby they get the house once you pass away, or you have them move in with you, but you continue paying for all the housing expenses so that they in effect get to live rent-free, but they're helping you. This is, or you can do it with a good friend or a younger person, like an au pair type person. There are arrangements that you can come up with that don't involve being in a nursing home.
Excellent. Well, I want to turn it back over to Rick and Larry to give us your final comments. We'll close it out. We have way too many questions and very unique questions that we can answer on air. But let me turn it back over to you. It's been a fun couple weeks. The topics have gone from marriage, divorce, kids, living longer, retiring, everything, long-term care insurance, inflation. We've covered a lot. Certainly not everything, but final words to you, please.
I guess my final word is that kind of keep your eye on the ball here, which the ball in economics is begins and ends with your living standard. It's, we want to make sure that we can have a smooth living standard right to the end of our days. We may plan to have it decline if we keep living and living and living, but we don't want it to drop dramatically at any point in time. That's consumption smoothing. We want to find ways to safely raise our living standard. We want to make decisions about moving, about housing, or about when to retire, about which school to attend, whether or not to borrow, what career to take, all these things based on our living standard. What is the implication of taking this more comfortable job versus this other job where I have to work many more hours per week to my living standard? I can't, unless we make these calculations, we're kind of buying things blindly. And then the fourth thing is understanding how our living standard would be impacted by different outcomes. So if we invest more aggressively, if we spend more aggressively through time, what does that mean for the possible downside to our living standard, as well as the upside, the kind of the spread of our living standard? That helps us understand our investment, how we want to invest, how much risk we want to undertake, and so those are the four key things in economics-based financial planning, and they're very different. That approach is very different. That living standard-focused approach is very different from conventional financial planning, and so I think there's some real value for people to look at it carefully.
Excellent. Rick, over to you. Final thoughts. It's been a fun couple of weeks.
It has. It
Absolutely.
has. I would say, just to add to what Larry said, that many of the decisions that we make in our lives, we tend to make on a very sort of emotional basis. We feel that one career feels better than another career. We feel that we have to have a bigger house, or we'd really like to live in that town, or any of a number of other decisions that we make. And I think that it's useful to know that you can get quantitative input that can help you make decisions that may make your life better. You can still listen to your emotions, but you can have those emotions informed by financial numbers, and that can help you make better decisions and have a better life.
Excellent. Well, I on behalf of everyone, all the thank you notes that are coming in, thank you so much for your time. Professor Kotlikoff, a personal finance expert, you've written 20 books, so I'm sure if we haven't hit it here, it's in one of those books. How can I get a hold of you? How can I see you next? Where can I get a hold of you? If in the event resources tab, download the slides. Both of their contact information is in there. Their phone numbers are in there. So I think you guys got some phone calls coming. Some passionate people about college. A couple people passionate about long-term care insurance and marriage and divorce. So the phone calls are coming. I do know that to see where you're going to see you next, Professor Kotlikoff, you will be at the Pensions and Investment East Coast Conference coming up in March. So I know we'll see you there. And for the plan sponsors who are going, they look forward to seeing you as well. With that, again, if you're looking forward to talking to Dimensional next, just look at our website, the dimensional.com website, and we are very pleased to bring these experts to you this year and going forward. Thank you so much.